for all of you on Zoom. We know there's no video feed, so I'm sorry you can't see me or us you, but thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know me or don't know me well, I'm Christy Morrison Thomas. I'm a longtime Spartan. I did my teacher prep here a while ago with Andy and Gail Richmond. Then I taught 6th grade science with the Department of Defense dependent schools, and then returned to Michigan. So I've been working here at Create with the Carbon Time Project and the Next Gen Professional Learning Team, and I graduated last year from our site program. So this presentation shares findings from our Carbon Time research and from my dissertation study to discuss how working with school districts and teachers unions can support us in pursuing three-dimensional engagement in science classroom teaching and learning. There we go. So I want to present MSU's land acknowledgement, recognizing together that we're meeting today in this beautiful, welcoming, Create space that exists on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. Okay. And I know there's going to be a few more people coming in, so as they join us, that will be great. And Zoom folks, if you need anything, put it in the chat, and Sue Carpenter or someone else will be checking it, shortly. And Sue, could I trouble you to just give a nod to our friends from our meeting, that if they want to join us, they can. Okay. So, my plan is to talk sort of the next 20-ish, 25-ish sort of minutes. So my hope is you just take a deep breath and lean into your chair and listen and hopefully enjoy and think and just make yourselves as comfortable as possible. So I want to open with something that I imagine that we all care about professionally, which is science classroom teaching and learning. And that we want young people who to be in science classrooms figuring out natural phenomena and using science and engineering as a way of solving problems that are meaningful to them. And we want teachers to experience the joy and have the tools to engage students in classroom science in this way. So many of us care about these things because of how students' classroom science experiences can affect their futures and our future as a society. In Carbon Time, we talk about this as supporting youth in growing into scientifically literate citizens who bring science knowledge and practices to their participation in public decisions about socio-scientific issues, something we see as essential in a democracy. Science classrooms contribute to this goal because students' engagement in next-generation science standards-aligned classrooms, or three-dimensional science classrooms, supports their use of science in exploring natural phenomena and solving problems. Further, students in these classrooms are better able to develop science identities, seeing themselves as science people and as science as a way of knowing the world that can inform their personal public decisions. Carbon Time stands for Carbon, Transformations in Matter and Energy, an NSF-funded design-based implementation research project that has worked to support NGSS-aligned classrooms at scale. For more than the last decade, our research and development teams have designed three-dimensional curriculum and assessments that support middle and high school students in tracing matter and energy in living and earth systems. We have designed and provided an aligned 2-year professional learning course of study through teacher support networks, an approach to science classroom reform we refer to as the 3 legs of the stool. The next few slides share some findings from our Carbon Time research that help us understand our goal for science classrooms engaged in three-dimensional science instruction. First, we have evidence that Carbon Time worked for students' three-dimensional science learning. On post-tests, 91% of students who studied Carbon Time, the peach bar graph, scored higher than the median for students previously taught by the same teachers using other curricula, the purple graph. Further, Carbon Time helped reduce the achievement gap within classrooms, meaning that students with lower pretest scores showed higher learning gains. The Carbon Time assessment items on these post-tests are three-dimensional transfer tasks, requiring students to investigate or explain novel phenomena related to their units of study. Our data set is large, reflecting 197,000 student assessments from more than 25,000 students, collected over 4 years from classrooms of 145 teachers at 94 schools across the United States. We further analyzed our student learning data to identify teachers as the most important factor affecting students' three-dimensional science classroom learning, more than students' prior knowledge or school demographic factors. This finding aligns with others from our field. Teachers are widely recognized as contributing to students' academic achievement. Our data show us that teachers matter, and this led us to a new question. How are teachers and their classroom instruction different in ways that affected students' three-dimensional science learning? I'm just going to pause here. If you're toward the back and you want to come up, please don't feel like you're interrupting. Thank you for being here. Okay, so we wanted to figure out how are teachers and science classrooms different? And in answering this question, we identified 3 categories of science classroom instruction. First, traditional teacher-centered learning involves teachers relying on textbooks and generally lecturing. Second, activity-based teaching relies on pace and novelty for motivation, while including high-interest activities, investigations, and hands-on activities that cover the curriculum without coordinating development of conceptual understanding. And finally, scaffolding students' three-dimensional learning uses sense-making and cognitive apprenticeship strategies to support students figuring out natural phenomena and achieving complex NGSS-aligned performances. Using interviews and video data, we found that teachers in our Carbon Time project did not endorse or enact teacher-centered learning. Using Carbon Time instructional materials and with professional learning experiences, our data suggests that all Carbon Time teachers engage students in at least activity-based instruction, with about half engaging in scaffolding students' three-dimensional learning. This is consequential because teachers' classroom instruction mattered for students' learning gains. Teachers in lower learning gains classrooms were engaged in activity-based instruction, while teachers in higher learning gains classrooms were scaffolding student sense-making. So our takeaway is that Carbon Time's 3 legs of the stool approach was good enough to make at least activity-based teaching normal, and to enable some teachers to engage their classroom in scaffolding students' three-dimensional learning. So then, what would it take for every teacher in every classroom to scaffold students' three-dimensional science experiences? How can we work with schools and districts to make that the new normal? My answer focuses on teachers' local, course-based professional communities, the group of teachers who teach the same course or content, like biology. Educational research suggests these communities can make a difference in students' learning and can close traditional achievement gaps. These course-based professional communities are situated within larger school and district communities that also include administrators, district science coordinators, and teachers' union leaders. Importantly, these course-based professional communities have the potential to affect what teachers do within their own individual classroom communities, more so than external networks like our Carbon Time ones. To figure out how and how much the course-based professional community affects individual classroom communities when teachers are with their students behind their own classroom doors, we need to pay attention to professional actions that cross the classroom door. For example, what goes into the classroom with the teacher? Is there a common curriculum? Are there common assessments? For us as science educators, are there three-dimensional instructional resources? What goes out of the classroom in terms of teachers' experiences and student work artifacts, assessment data, or grades? And what do teachers do when they're together in their course-based professional communities? How does that work? Connect what goes out of the classroom with what goes back into the classroom. For instance, do teachers discuss their classroom experiences and student performances in ways that lead to revisions in common instructional resources? This is what I explored in my dissertation study, which was built around 4 districts in Michigan with a number of similarities. They all used carbon time materials in high school biology. They were large enough to have multiple biology teachers. They were generally perceived as having enough economic resources and were perceived as locally successful. But our experiences as a carbon time team suggested that despite those similarities, things were different. So in 2 rounds, 1 year apart, I interviewed high school biology teachers, school district science coordinators, and teachers union leaders. Study findings suggest that there are 2 orientations to teachers' course-based professional communities that matter for making 3-dimensional science learning experiences normal. One is the extent to which the professional community's work focuses on 3-dimensional science or not. In this study, 1 of the 4 districts was not 3-dimensionally oriented. In that district, most biology teachers were engaged in activity-based teaching with a focus on 1-dimensional rigor. The other districts were 3-dimensionally oriented, meaning that there were wide efforts to at least begin scaffolding students' 3-dimensional learning. The second orientation is the degree to which teachers operated individually or collectively. This is the orientation I'll focus on next as I share an example of professional actions that cross the classroom door in each kind of district. In individually oriented districts, whether or not a student experienced 3-dimensional classroom engagement depended on their individual teacher. In such a district, even though carbon time units were available for all the classrooms, teachers were described as having a lot of freedom with the curriculum. One teacher said, only 3 of the 6 of us biology teachers are doing carbon time lessons. In this district, teachers used common course-level exams modeled off of the new state science MSAT. Student results on these local assessments left the classroom and were available for use by the course-based professional community, but the focus remained on individual teachers. The district science coordinator described her efforts in helping teachers use students' common assessment data as, how do I use data to empower myself? This is very different than the collectively oriented district. Here, all teachers were described as scaffolding students' 3-dimensional learning. Teachers used common instructional resources, even teaching the exact same units with 85 to 90% of the same lesson plans, as well as classroom assessments for both end-of-unit summatives and end-of-course exams. What left in the classroom included student performances on these 3-dimensional assessments, as well as students' grades, which, due to common grading policies, actually reflected students' 3-dimensional achievement. This information, alongside teachers' experiences, were used by the course-based professional community to make revisions to shared units and assessments. Professional actions that cross the classroom door are consequential to students' equitable science opportunities because they're related to how normal scaffolding students' 3-dimensional learning is within a group of science teachers. Only in the collective district were all students experiencing similarly complex 3-dimensional classroom engagement. So it's important to consider what makes these professional actions different in these different districts. The professional actions are different because of different roles and responsibilities of teachers in their classrooms, with their course-based professional communities, and among the larger school and district community. This makes sense when we consider that school districts today are involved in the work of organizing and managing classroom instruction and are considered a critical level for school improvement. And in this state, local teachers' unions negotiate with school districts around issues of teachers' compensation and working conditions, which includes teachers' non-instructional time. Contrary to common narratives, local unions tend to accommodate, not actively oppose, instructional reforms. Next, I'll share some examples of how roles and responsibilities are different in individually and collectively oriented districts. This will give us a sense for what classroom teaching and learning is like there, since that is the focus of much of our science research and development. Okay, first, let's talk about teachers' classroom pedagogical responsibilities, which is to whom or what teachers feel beholden as they work with students behind their classroom doors. In the individually oriented districts, these were described as different among different teachers, coexisting side by side. Some teachers described students figuring out unit driving questions as beautiful and exciting, while other teachers were described as more traditional, focusing primarily on content. One participant said, "Neither way is better. It's just what works for him and what works for me." This means that students have different learning experiences and are pursuing different learning goals depending on which biology teacher they have on their schedule. This contrasts with the collectively oriented district. There, every teacher was described as holding classroom pedagogical responsibilities to students' three-dimensional science classroom experiences and outcomes. Next, if we look at teachers' perspectives around working with their peers, teachers in the individually oriented districts valued working with like-minded colleagues, but they didn't want to spend time trying to convince other folks to share common goals for student classroom experiences. Very differently, in the collectively oriented district, teachers described their work with their colleagues as integral to their individual classroom work. Working together with their course-based professional community was requisite for teachers to realize their own classroom pedagogical responsibilities. These descriptions speak to how teachers do not always find collaboration beneficial. It incurs costs. Transaction costs reflect the time and effort involved in working together, and conflict costs reflect relationship-related energy, because working together toward common decisions inherently involves disagreements and disputes. Not surprisingly, in the individually oriented districts, each teacher experienced autonomy around their own classroom decisions, and participants described very typical norms for professional privacy and non-interference. One teacher said, "My colleague's philosophy is, let me close my door and do what I'm doing, and it works." They might be right. Their thing might be working for them. It is not my domain to decide what's good for other teachers. Teachers in the collective professional community also described feeling autonomy in their classrooms, describing this as autonomy to experiment instructionally with success defined through students' performances on common assessments. This experimental perspective is captured in this quote. If a teacher were to say, "Well, I don't want to do it that way," well, that's fine. Put your own twist on things, and let's talk about it afterwards and see how it went. This is an important difference. In the individually oriented district, teachers' autonomy is located within each individual teacher, but in the collectively oriented district, the autonomy exists at the level of the teacher's course-based professional community. Districts and unions endorsed these different responsibilities. In the individually oriented districts, district and union leaders endorsed both collaboration and autonomy, acknowledging, we know from research that teachers that collaborate do better, but it's important for teachers to have the autonomy to work together in ways each individual views as valuable. In the collective district, district and union leaders endorsed professional community work as integral to three-dimensional classroom instruction. Participants in the collective district said, the message from the district is clear. This is not optional. NGSS is not optional. And the union said, common instruction is what we do here. The district and union distributed leadership to the course-based professional community itself, making that group the decision makers around course-specific instructional materials and even classroom instructional practices. I want to pause for a minute to reiterate how teachers' course-based professional communities are situated with larger school and district communities, which include all teachers and administrators, district science coordinators, people in instructional coaching positions, union leaders, and others. This is one way we can explain how consistent the stories from each district were, which was actually something that initially surprised me in the interviews. I had anticipated interviews to be most similar based on role, like local union leaders would be more similar to each other, but this wasn't the case. Teachers, union leaders, and district science coordinators' interviews were most like interviews from other people in the same district. This makes the case for the powerful nature of these school and district communities and their shared stories. Last, district and union leaders in collective districts also played necessary roles in actually reducing the transaction and conflict costs inherent in consensus-seeking work. So teachers in the collective district experienced lower transaction costs because their district and union provided regular time for course-based professional communities to do the work of developing and revising common instructional resources. This happened through contractual after-school meetings, paid summer work time, and in-school release time with subs. Further, teachers experienced lower conflict costs because the district and union provided facilitation training for teacher leaders, stability in teaching assignments, and there was both accountability to group decisions and support provided for individual teachers through the course-based professional community. So the question we needed to answer in order to make changes in science education that affect what we care about was what would it take for every student in every classroom to be engaged in three-dimensional science experiences? And at least part of the answer is attention to and empowerment of local, course-based teacher professional communities and to district-level collective orientations. In the examples provided, every district had carbon time instructional materials officially and had teachers participating in pull-out professional learning experiences, but only one, where the local course-based professional community had three-dimensional and collective orientations. Did participants describe all biology classrooms engaged in three-dimensional instruction and all teachers assessing students' three-dimensional performances? These findings have implications for students' success and teachers' instructional improvement within schools and districts. The example districts used common three-dimensional science classroom assessments. In the individually oriented districts, participants described how using students' science assessment data could inform teachers' individual improvement, as in the quote from the district science coordinator wanting to help her teachers use data to empower themselves. But participants were clear that comparisons across teachers were idiosyncratic and unfair. Such comparisons were viewed as summative judgments, potentially with high-stakes consequences. Differently, in the collectively oriented district, cross-teacher comparisons of students' assessment results and grades were viewed formatively, informing revisions to instructional materials and explorations of teachers' classroom practices. In this way, the entire course-based professional community could engage in instructional improvement together. Something important here, I think, is that we, as science education researchers and developers, generally recognize that teachers' instruction matters for students' science classroom achievement. But this belief was widely endorsed only in the collectively oriented district. Finally, I want to engage in some heartfelt advocacy. First, as science education researchers and developers, our expertise is an important part of teachers, schools, and districts reaching this vision in which every classroom is engaged in three-dimensional science learning. In fact, one of the characteristics of the collective district was their connections to external sources of science support, including MSU. In that district, most biology teachers were connected to professional learning experiences through MSU, through their local ISD, and through the state. That ensured the local professional community was developing expertise aligned with that of external leaders in science education. Second, we can endorse teachers' local course-based professional communities as integral to three-dimensional science classroom instruction. So when we invite teachers or administrators to leave their buildings for pull-out experiences, we can work to make connections to participants' local professional communities and their roles and responsibilities there. Further, we can organize and facilitate professional actions that cross the classroom door. Many of us already engage teachers in these activities, but often do so in ways that allow for interested teachers to opt in. Taking steps so that these activities are embedded within local course-based professional communities is important and requires including district and union leaders in our work. I understand that working with school districts or union leaders in this way may feel outside of your interests. So I'm advocating for you to reach out to me, to the Michigan Math and Science Leadership Network with Dr. Mary Starr, to our ISDs, such as Oakland Schools with James and Andrea here in the room, and to others like us who want to help you engage in research practice partnerships by building plans and questions into your future proposals and your future work. Before I close, I have one additional example that speaks to the need for the kind of local research and practice partnering for which I'm advocating. This example is from pilot work funded by a Digital Promise Seed grant. Middle school science teachers in one district described classroom pedagogical responsibilities to students' science success, which is great, right? Yay. From their perspectives, such success meant students know the NGSS disciplinary core ideas, content. Students feel comfortable engaging in science class activities and assessments. And students clearly understand the expectations about what they need to do to earn points in science class. These classroom pedagogical responsibilities seemed to drive teacher changes to an Open SciEd mid-unit summative assessment to prioritize DCIs and add scaffolding to the task that reduced uncertainty. And teachers described making coordinating decisions about their classroom instruction. Though the changes likely helped students feel more comfortable and understand the expectations to earn points in science class, they also reduced the three-dimensional nature of classroom experiences and assessment tasks. This highlights how these local orientations around three-dimensional science can play a role in students' classroom experiences. In this case, common local understandings of student science success and common locally modified assessments are coming together in ways that actually make students' science classroom experiences less three-dimensional. Teachers and students' local needs to feel successful and earn and assign fair grades were working unknowingly against complex three-dimensional instruction and assessment. So there's a need for learning and development together, which can support students, teachers, and researchers' needs. So thank you. I appreciate your time and attention, and I would love to listen to your ideas and comments and respond to questions you might have. Yes, Christina?
So Christy, I might have missed it, but can you elaborate that last case that you were just talking about? I'd really like to know more about this because I would suspect it happens a lot. And I can even imagine it happening here in my own, our own classes. Well, in the sense that we're trying to work at helping our pre-service elementary teachers maybe learn the content and feel comfortable, and in what ways are we working against the things that we're actually trying to look for?
Sure. So I'd love to say a little bit more about this. Also, definitely couching it in the experience that it was, which was pilot work with a small group of teachers. But I think it really matches things that we have found in Carbon Time, which is like the primary decision-making motivator is teachers' perception of their local classroom success, which in this case was like kids are feeling comfortable and like they seem happy and they'll engage in these activities and they'll feel like they know how they're going to earn their points and be successful. Like that's that core like compelling classroom pedagogical responsibility. And the teachers in this pilot study were particularly thinking about students in their classroom that they perceive to be from marginalized or minoritized communities. So they would describe these experiences where they would get up, to do the iterative model building, and it would be like, right, total, everything screeched to a halt, and they were especially concerned about all the kids they saw not being successful. So then they scaffolded it more, or they did the task and shared it with the kids and talked about it together. So we see this huge decrease in three-dimensional classroom engagement, and then those same things were happening on the assessment tasks that were provided by OpenSciEd. So the big page where they draw the model was totally scaffolded into a fill-in-the-blank, one-dimensional, experience. So I think the way I see our involvement is that the classroom teachers' number one motivation was the kids in their room and what they perceived was working or not working, and these needs that they had as teachers and kids and families have around fair and clear grades. But when we had the opportunity through this pilot work to talk about it together, to look at the modified assessment task and talk about the 3 dimensions, it was they had the opportunity to make some reflections on the decisions that they were making. And I think that's really valuable for them, but also for us as researchers and as curriculum writers and professional learning providers, because in the OpenSciEd teacher's guide, there's very, very little, almost nothing about grading. But that was a real point for these teachers. That's a huge part of success from their perspective. And they're really paying attention to it. They're we care about these kids. We care about all our kids.
So could we keep going on that and tell us what sort of things you, sorry, I'm
Please.
very interested in this. Do you give them, what were things that tended to work to make improvement? How did you help them work through some of this, or what did they do?
I wrote a grant to Spencer Foundation for Research Practice Partnership that if they fund Christina, I'm going to be in there with them to answer all of this together. So until then, I think the pilot work, we're talking about a handful of hours, right? But even that little bit of work opened up some spaces for the teachers to think on their own, and the district science coordinator being able to take up how much of what she has been working with her district teachers around is being taken up in this way that's a little bit counter to where the goals are, and how much it's you saying the same things didn't mean the same things. So I think really more than solutions, it opened up this problem space. So I'll have more answers. If you know anybody at Spencer, that'd be really great. Because this is the work I would really like to do. I mean, personally and professionally, but also I think is really, really necessary, because we, as a community of science educators, researchers and development or educators, can't understand these. They're really complex and many factored issues without being able to be in partnership and in conversation. And it took a long time with a couple teachers I already really know to be able to get through the kind of dialogue that opened up oh, yeah, what I did here really isn't that 3-dimensional, and oh, is that actually not what's best for my kids? And oh, and so I think those things can't be just one time, right? It takes so much. Working with districts and maybe teacher students is sometimes challenging too, right? Their schedules and their priorities are different, and so I think it takes a lot of partnering and relationships. Thank you. Chad.
So, as a science teacher myself,
Yes.
so I really appreciate this whole discussion. It seems as impactful as the experiences in the classroom with the curriculum, between the teacher and the student. It seems that the overarching area of importance would really be the the environment in which the adults are actually working, right? And so in that successful district, were you able to kind of identify some factors that allowed their kind of community-oriented, collective-oriented work experience to exist? And do you think that can inform, how curriculum design, curriculum development by, research organizations such as yourself approach that issue or approach that part of the problem, or challenge, I should say?
Well, I think I would say two things. First, for a classroom teacher, the most important thing really seems to be their classroom, right? Like the primary, that pedagogical responsibility, the primary motivation around decision making is really like, what do I perceive in terms of how things are working in my classroom? And for many, many science teachers, that is not three-dimensional science learning. Like that is not the primary thing. Plus, I mean, how do you even know, right? There's that whole question. So that idea that you're successful in your classroom and with your kids, that's the most important thing, I think, from an individual classroom teacher. To get that to occur, that being this complex three-dimensional instruction where kids and teachers are engaged in figuring out phenomena together, really requires an environment that supports these course-based professional communities, and that's where the districts and the NEA and other teachers unions come in to sort of set up that professional context, which is both about beliefs and responsibilities and what they endorse. It's about the stories that we tell each other in those professional spaces, and it's also about roles to reduce those transaction and conflict costs. I think, in terms of our work as science educators, as researchers and developers, I think that my push is expanding the space that we're paying attention to, because most of us focus right there in the classroom, and that's really important, but reaching the goals we want there have all these other spaces to pay attention to. So I think more than maybe changes in the curriculum we're writing, maybe a little bit there in terms of trying to think through the local success needs of teachers, but more than that, I think it's about stories we're telling as professional learning providers, as collaborators and partners, and opening up these things as important. Thanks, Jack.
Christy, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that district's attitude toward parental expectations about equity in students' classroom experiences.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Andy knows this from my research and worked with me on this. But I have another slide that's more complicated. Let me go back to. So here, this particular district, this is the more complex model that has all of the components we sort of talked about in. But this part here, number 5, the local public community, in this particular district, the local community, parents, students, at large, supported and wanted common expectations for all students. And this was something we did not hear that advocated or explicitly mentioned in other districts. And so this is both the public community and the district and union leadership, sending out those messages that equitable experiences and what was good for all kids was that NGSS, all standards for all students, and they use that language as district and union leaders, and it either influenced the community or matched community expectations. That part's unclear. That was outside of what I dug into. But what was interesting was in this district and then the district that was one-dimensionally oriented, those were the two districts where participants talked about the influence of that local public community. The others really, it didn't really come up. But in the one-dimensional oriented district, that was the source of success. Well, what we're doing works, because our kids go to these universities and they pursue these jobs and we do this well on these state tests. And it was different here in this district where it was like, we're doing well for all of our students because we've done all standards for all students. And there was this expectation, around how commonness was good for everybody and didn't somehow decrease the rigor or the high expectations for some students. Is that what was on your mind or the?
Yeah, and I was struck by the difference between like our experience as parents in a more individually oriented community, where our goal as parents was knowing that kids would have different experiences, different classes. How do you strategize to get your kids into the good teachers' classes? And this particular district was pushing back on that. They were saying, we want to make it so it doesn't matter whose class you're in. The kids are all going to get the same quality experience.
Thanks.
And that was a district commitment that was really, certainly different from the district my kids went to.
True. Thank you. I see a question from Andrea, and then we have one online from Elizabeth.
So just to go along with that, so I'm Andrea from the ISD, so call us up anytime. Sort of, my hunch would be that this district used to look like that district at some point in time. And so I wonder a little bit about if you have any knowledge of like the transition that took place in this district to make it more collectively oriented, because I'm also just thinking about timing and like the fact that it sounds like this district already went through that transition and that's when they took off carbon time, as opposed to the other district that had not ruined that way yet. And they were trying the same resource and there were different outcomes.
Okay. Thank you for asking this question. You've actually brought this up one other time. I'm so glad you're bringing it up now. And yes, I do have some information about to speak to that. And Elizabeth, I think that this may speak to your question about getting district leaders like superintendents involved in these kinds of initiatives. So first, let me say that Andrea is exactly correct. That in this district, the push for common expectations preceded NGSS. So what happened then was the teachers had to get together and come up with their common biology units, and they described them as ugly compromise units, and it was difficult and they hated it, and everyone was dissatisfied, but it was common. And then NGSS came along, and for the science teachers it was like, oh, all right, this kind of gives us an excuse to redo it better. So that was definitely true. They were pre-prepared to move into the common space with NGSS. So that is very true. That said, a part of their story is about the district's assistant superintendent, the curriculum and instruction person in the district, taking a look at where things were for the district and realizing that although overall the district was very successful, there were groups of kids who weren't, and stepping in, his leadership definitely was a huge part of the story. He stepped in and was like, whoa, we are actually not okay here. We need common expectations. We need common assessments and accountability to those things. They made a whole new, they call it a monument, their school improvement, district-wide, beliefs. And at that point, the teachers at the secondary level went to the teachers union, and they were like, here's our contract, we have this autonomy, to teach what we want, we need to grieve this is not okay. And the union evaluated it and said, well, this is okay. Having common expectations about what we teach and how we assess, that's good for kids, it's good for our profession, and we're going to make sure we can do it in this way where the course-based community has that decision-making autonomy. The district superintendent didn't say, you have to do, this science curriculum. And there were things like I mentioned, the training, the time, summer compensation. We're talking about year after year after year. So there's this continuity Whereas one of the other districts who was working on this, one of the teachers was like, we've done this common assessment thing before. I know how it goes. We're gonna get paid this summer, we're gonna write these assessments, then there's no more support for us, and they have to be revised, and it's not gonna, and then no one's gonna do it. And it was like, so the investment here, thinking into the future, we recognize that that is not normal yet, and yet, these are big pushes coming through all kinds of spaces outside of science. So, finding ways, like to Elizabeth, to your question in the chat, where what's important to the superintendents can be, wedded together with, things that work also in science and work for all students and like those sorts of things, that it's like one sort of big push instead of, and also this and also this and also this. And Andrea, the last thing about, this particular district, and I know I said this before, but the number of connections that the district was able to make with these external support networks, like your ISDs like yours, the state, MSU, not just Carbon-Time, but others, helped like infuse many individual teachers with very similar ideas and understanding. And that definitely, there's a systems piece to this, and there's also an individual leadership piece to this. The individual teachers union leaders over time, the district science coordinator, that superintendent I was talking about, like all those things really fed together for a lot of success.
Christy, just on that, and I think to the point that was made over here, what is of keen interest to the superintendent, which is of course one of the key factors in allowing this district to exist the way it does, is that superintendent feels safe that they will continue to have a job. Okay, that's number one. But then their ability to execute, is to have a vision and then have an ability to articulate that in a way that will satisfy the parents who are keenly interested in their own children having an excellent experience, such that equity doesn't mean, lowered, learning experiences, right? And so that's one of the key areas in terms of how important leadership is. But then in terms of the response of the local union, which I am a MEA Uniserv director myself, so I've been in those situations, and those is for the common assessment concepts that is accepted by the educator. Once it's understood that common assessment can provide objectivity in evaluation, because now there is a singular kind of like a standard, as it were, as opposed to different, somebody teaches this way, somebody teaches that way, then it's subjective, and it's up to the administrator who's observing them whether they like it or not, or whether it's successful or not. That accepting the common curriculum, the common assessment, the common planning concept is a way to now allow them to feel almost free, well, completely free, to have their efficacy as educators shine through, as opposed to being subject to the whims or the observations of others. So those two things, the common assessment part and the common planning part is super important, and that leadership that can exist at the decision-making level, super important.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think, to build on what Chad just said, this is the district where, together the teachers were, they admitted they didn't like it. Like, they did not like looking at de-identified student assessment results from different teachers. Like, it was uncomfortable. And yet they also said, yeah, it helped us have these conversations around what's actually happening in classrooms. And like support for teachers whose students were doing less well, instead of like targeting an individual teacher, it came through the course-based professional community. So together they were like, all right, what are we gonna do about Unit 1? And so it was this collective approach that really benefited everyone in ways that helps that like comfort. You were talking about, from the leadership level, and then here at the, individual teacher level. Yeah, Jane?
So, you probably know that Andrea and I are building out some networks there, and growth has been, throughout the state, working with leadership teams and such in individual districts. And I wonder how you might take some of the ideas that you've gleaned here and see how they might work in a broader context. And I'd love to experiment with that with you.
Hey, yes, we should definitely do that. Maybe the one thing that I notice is like a thing to pay attention to. This just happened yesterday. Like I had a short meeting with like MyStar professional learning providers and curriculum developers, and like I shared a few things like briefly, and then I noticed how like we say, these things like, well, we meet in our course space, we meet in our PLCs, our PLTs, our TLNs, right? And everyone's like, oh yeah, we do that. And it's like, oh, well, we have these common assessments. Oh yeah, we have those. And it's, I think what's different, and now I remember like puzzling through this, right? I was like, oh, your interview data, and you're like, right? They all have this PLCs, like what's going on? And so really being able to think about it in a context like this, like not just like, do you have a PLC? Check. But like, how often are you meeting? What are you doing? How do you know if people are there? How do you know if people aren't there? Like just all these things and how complex it is. And so I think as we think about, one of the things that pops in my head immediately as we move out of specific, school and district contexts is how many more, voices are in the room, like, oh yeah, we do that, when really it takes some, analysis, and time, which from my point of view is one of the outcomes of like this study is like, now I have a model, like now I have a list. So now I can use those things, we can all use those things to help understand what's happening in local context, hopefully a little bit faster than like the dissertation process, and then be in a spot to begin to like take action, because this particular study was not action oriented directly. Yeah. Thanks. Betsy?
So one of the things that I find fascinating about this is your inclusion of the union in your conception of the system. And I feel like that is, as far as I've seen, completely missing in the science ed literature, right? And I guess I was interested in what drew you to be focusing, including the union in your consideration of what matters. Was there something in the literature that pointed you in that direction, or was that a personal commitment of yours, or was there something you saw in those districts that you were like, ooh, we should look at the unions here?
Well, thank you. I love that you asked that question. I would definitely, this is like my, family sort of like life story that came with me. Like my grandpa was partially fired for union organizing downriver. My dad was in jail when we were like, my sister and I were like 4 or something because of his work. They were both teachers in his union work, and that's like a huge story, right? But all along in that growing up, and this is true for many of us who grew up, at least in like the lower half of Michigan in the last 50 whatever years, that like understanding unions as collective organizations that support people in doing their jobs well and safely and compensated in ways that allow you to be like a human and have a family, like that's like a real core belief, I think, of many of us in these spaces. So that, was something I definitely grew up with. And then here at MSU, as a pre-service teacher, I was involved in the Michigan Education Association's student program, which is now called Aspiring Educators. And that was really cool. And the NEA and the MEA are just like these organizations as a young person just filled with, expertise and mentors and people passionate about public education. And then from there, I think the story I was telling earlier where like I wasn't tall enough to look over the podium was because I went to the National Education Association and I served as their student program chairperson for 2 years in between like my bachelor's and then returning to do my student teaching internship with Andy. So those things definitely shaped my point of view. And in thinking about how teachers' unions can be involved in meaningful ways in professional actions. But I also, I wasn't sure what would really come out. When finally, the researcher hat went on and, the data was in front of me, I was like, maybe it's not gonna say that, unions play a meaningful role. It really might not. So many of the interviews in other districts were well, how is the union involved in science classroom teaching, crickets, right? They even had the questions in advance. But then, the pattern that began to show up, which was clearest here, the teachers were like, oh yeah, our union's really powerful, and our union stands up for us as professionals, in this way. And I think this is not, we hold this up as an example, but it's not singular to that particular local teachers union, and more and more, there was an effort for a while, and then, with legislative changes here in Michigan, things changed, but really MEA's commitment to professional learning, to the Center for Leadership and Learning, which is new organizationally, in the last handful of time. I think there's more and more an understanding, a belief that we're in this together. Right? This is our public education system, so yeah. I'm glad you asked. I get to tell a little bit of my story. Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful. So there's not anything else on your minds. I just really appreciate you all coming and joining me and talking together, and yeah, reach out. This is definitely the stuff I care about, and understand that it expands things that you're working on into spaces maybe less enticing, and there are maybe not, but there are people who really